Hello and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the show, thanks for listening today, and if you've listened before, welcome back. Sometimes we know from the very beginning that a person just isn't for us. While those relationships can certainly be pretty difficult, there's a clarity to them that tends to simplify things. Then there are those people who seem, at least at first glance, like a great match. A charming colleague, a gregarious and interesting friend, or a potential romantic partner who seems head over heels for you. But over time, things get more complicated. The charm begins to feel manipulative, the friendliness turns into self-centeredness, and the care and intention start to seem a bit more controlling. Today, we're focusing on these types of relationships, particularly those involving what are known as the dark triad of personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sociopathy. These traits can lurk beneath the surface, hidden beneath a facade of charisma and likability. But as time goes on, a person's true nature inevitably emerges, revealing patterns of manipulation, a lack of empathy, and a relentless focus on their own needs. We'll be exploring some of the key features of these personality traits, the signs to look out for, and the strategies you can use to protect yourself and manage these challenging relationships. So to help me do that, I'm joined today by clinical psychologist Dr. Rick Hanson. So Dad, how are you doing?
I'm good, and I'm very interested in this topic.
Yeah, same. I was really looking forward to this one. As a quick note before we start, we're focusing today on what I'll call subclinical presentations of these personality traits. And that's kind of a technical way of saying fairly mild, everyday forms of them. These are people who tend towards egocentrism. Maybe they aren't very empathic, or they have kind of a loose relationship with the truth and with different kinds of moral standards. And part of the reason that we're doing that is because extreme cases of these things are really quite rare. While it's become common to be pretty casual about referring to somebody as a narcissist or a sociopath, the research suggests that true NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is present in maybe like 1 or 2% of the population at any given time. It's kind of the same for antisocial personality disorder. That's the heading that things like sociopathy get placed under. And as we were prepping for this conversation, Dad, you even said that in your, very long life, because you're pretty old, over that long period of time, so long, so much life, so old, you have met really very few people that you would slot as having the kind of full on, or even the 50% version of what we're talking about today. So that's part of the reason that we're broadening it out here.
That's right. I would say I've had a lot of clients who have definitely had someone who essentially fit the package. As a relative, sometimes a parent, tragically, certainly sometimes as a coworker, sometimes as a neighbor, and often as a friend. Someone who started out and they seemed so nice, and yet over time, it got stickier and weirder and weirder. And so I definitely have a fair amount of experience helping people deal with folks like that. But I just want to say that, and I don't mean this as a slam, I just mean this as a statistical observation. I think there's certain occupations that tend to have a higher density of people of this sort than, say, people who want to become a psychotherapist.
Yeah.
Although there was Hannibal Lecter. We should not forget him, of course.
So part of what we're going to be talking about today is exactly what you said. What do you do when your boss has these traits, or your parent has these traits, or your friend has these traits? Or, hey, there's somebody you really like, you're very into, and you've got a pretty good relationship with them, but you get to the 9-month mark and things are going okay, but some of these traits are starting to appear. They might not be bad enough that they're totally disqualifying, but you're aware that maybe there's a little bit of this personality structure going on. So we keep on saying these traits, Dad. What are we talking about when we say these traits?
What you're talking about, and what this seminal paper from Delroy Paulhus and Kevin Williams in 2002 talked about, is this combination of being narcissistic, which is to say very self-referential and often oriented around a kind of grandiose self-aggrandizing, and a very prickly sensitivity to feeling devalued, combined with Machiavellian, quote unquote, tendencies to be manipulative, which I mean specifically not trying to influence people in open and direct ways, but rather being deceptive. sometimes by pitting other people against each other and then kind of sitting back and, watching them fight it out. And then the third quality, sociopathy, a fundamental indifference to the suffering of others, a very, very transactional and kind of low level of moral reasoning, and that combination. There are people throughout history that have fit the total package. Caligula, probably going all the way back to Rome.
Nero,
and
sure, yeah.
maybe some more recent characters too. And what we're going to explore here is the ways in which these qualities can be present in challenging people in our life, including, I want to emphasize, when they're under pressure. In other words, when people are getting what they want and it's all going fine, they don't always show their true colors. But when they're under pressure, like when you bring your own need to them, or you complain about something to them, or you call them out on some kind of lie or playing fast and loose with the truth, you bring a moral dimension to them. Whoa, then the mask falls away and the beast is revealed.
So another phrase that we might use here are just antisocial traits. At the clinical level, again, mostly what we're not talking about today, antisocial personality disorder, this is abbreviated ASPD, sometimes APD, but normally ASPD, is characterized by a limited capacity for empathy, a pattern of disregard for the wants or rights of others, impulsivity, recklessness, and a general lack of remorse. In maybe more plain language, these are people who tend to be motivated by self-interest, and they're generally willing to use other people as means to their own ends when necessary. They tend to prioritize themselves. They often have a lack of empathy, so limited ability to empathize with other people's emotions. They tend to be at least somewhat manipulative, whether it's through charm and deceit or even just more like good strategic planning. And then they often have sort of what I'll call a flexible relationship with the truth. They're open to lying if it serves them. They might chronically misremember things that happened in the past. You might notice yourself getting into a lot of almost technical feeling debates with them about a word that was used, what that word really meant, what it didn't mean. All of that kind of stuff might come forward here. So now I've got a question for you here. These tendencies that I've just listed are not very likable to be around, by and large. They're mostly punished socially. People don't really want to be around manipulative or more antagonistic people. So how do they get away with it? Like, how does this work? If they're just kind of unpleasant, then why would we find ourselves in relationship with these people? And why would they be in positions of power even?
Ooh, I take it back myself to sociobiology. And that's a fraught phrase. Think about our evolution in hominin bands, and then early humans, and then Stone Age humans. Long period of time in which there was a lot of evolutionary selection on people who could cooperate inside the band and be compassionate inside the band and willing to be regulated by the will of the band as a whole, which could then regulate the few. While at the same time, it was really important in the human genome to have people who could be very callous and cruel and aggressive and indifferent toward those outside the band. That combination, the wolf of love and the wolf of hate, if you will, still lives within the human heart. And it's distributed. These tendencies and qualities are distributed in the population in terms of their genetic basis. Then you take people who, let's say, were born as the wolf of love genetically, and yet grew up in environments that were really, really punishing, even abusive, chaotic, and which it just made sense to be looking out for number one from the day, you could figure anything out for yourself. So there are different reasons why people become who they are. And then we have, I think the title of the book was The Sociopaths Next Door. There are people who will write memoirs and they'll say, honestly, it's never been inside me to care about anybody but myself. I've had to learn to operate pragmatically in a transactional way so that I give in order to get. But the truth is, I really don't give a damn about you. And as long as you understand that, we can be neighbors and share a fence and let our kids play with each other. So statistically, there's probably actually a fair amount of, if you will, predisposition, certainly toward basic forms of sociopathy in the general population. So why are there these people? Well, because there are a lot of them. And that goes to the importance of having systems in our modern collective societies that serve the functions that occurred in our small hunter-gatherer bands that regulate the wolf of hate, tap into its passion and power as needed, but in general, keep it within bounds. So then the question becomes, how do we create those kind of systems in society as a whole? And then how do we, create them in our friend groups and our companies, in our family systems, and so forth.
I think that's a great explanation, Dad, of how these tendencies are present in people, almost from kind of an evolutionary perspective. Like, if these traits had a lot of costs associated with them, well, why didn't they just evolve out of us? And the answer to that question always is, well, either they came with more benefits than you realized, or they weren't costly enough to be selected out. Either of those is a plausible explanation with what we're talking about today. Pragmatically, in terms of how any one person can keep on moving socially, how they can be the sociopath next door without anyone really realizing it, is that these traits are often very well disguised in people.
Yep.
Sometimes they're disguised consciously, sometimes they're disguised unconsciously. It's not like inside of themselves they have a lot of buy-in to being cruel or manipulative or whatever. It's just more of kind of an unconscious personality structure. They just fall into being really egocentric or sort of disinterested in the needs of other people. But generally, these people learn how to play the social game quite well and can be quite charismatic in order to mask these kinds of traits that are often very socially costly. Now, an important thing to remember is that not every charismatic person is antisocial, and not every antisocial is charismatic. But if it's immediately easy for everybody to recognize that a person has these more antisocial traits, ironically, their capacity to do harm is pretty limited. So the people actually to look out for are the ones where these traits are a little bit more skillfully concealed.
That's a really interesting counterintuitive observation.
Yeah.
To kind of build on your point, so there's nature and nurture. Okay. Whatever is true about, the genetically rooted range of prosocial, compassionate, caring orientations versus, let's say, at the other end of the spectrum, low natural empathy, kind of indifference to others. Okay, whatever is true about that, then life happens to do. And one of the factors of life we haven't yet named is privilege. People kind of become this way because they could get away with it. Think about
no, for sure.
Yeah, think about that. Those good-looking, athletic, popular kids in high school who could get away with a lot of stuff because it
becomes a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like if people are constantly fluffing you for being good-looking and athletic and whatever, it's easy to internalize those narcissistic supplies, sometimes in less healthy ways.
Yeah, and then throw in wealth. There's a lot of research that shows, just sadly, that as a broad observation with many individual exceptions, but as a tendency, as wealth increases, compassion for particularly those outside the group decreases over time. One of my favorites is some studies from Dr. Keltner, for example, UC Berkeley and his team there. Some grad student did this thing where basically they stood at a crosswalk in a urban setting, and
I remember this, yeah.
And then they started, and deliberately in a way that was quite controlled and videotaped and so forth, they would, as a car was approaching, they would step onto the crosswalk, and then they would see if the car would stop. And in California law, if someone's on a crosswalk, you're supposed to stop. And then they would track which kind of cars would slow down and stop versus which kind of cars would speed up and race through the intersection. And there was a high statistical correlation between the expensiveness of the car and the degree to which he would just race through the intersection.
Yeah, those stereotypes about BMW drivers, man, they're coming in hot here.
Yeah, And there are other examples.
Sure. Yes.
So I think
many other examples.
we could throw that
I didn't
into
mean, sorry, BMW drivers out there. I didn't. My bad. This is
nice
just like a
car.
car
It's a
forum
nice
thing. Don't worry
car.
about it.
Okay, good. Anyway, so that's something to think about as well. And, it's a bit of a corrective for those of us like me who've been privileged in various ways societally, right? White, male, straight, middle class, professional now, and so forth, to take into account any of the little ways that we ourselves have been able to get away with some stuff.
Easy to fall into.
Yeah. And to slide into a certain amount of manipulation and using other people and, kind of moving through life, not having to pay much attention to the wreckage we leave behind us.
Yeah. Just to summarize what you're saying here, Dad, as you move up the social ladder, you don't need to care as much about a lot of these things because you acquire status that shields you from the social consequences of having these behaviors. So it's natural for them to track each other. It's deeply unfortunate that this results in people in powerful positions often being less and less concerned with the circumstances or the lives of the people who are underneath them.
Yeah.
But it is a very well documented thing that we're talking about here. And because these traits are concealed and the concealment of them is so important in order to kind of keep the racket going, the maintenance of this act tends to be very important to people who have it, particularly if they're conscious about it. More unconscious, lower end of the spectrum behaviors, this might not be so much of a thing. But if a person really does kind of know that they're in on the joke about these things that they're doing or the way that their personality is structured, maintaining that facade, very, very high stakes. So they tend to be very reactive to criticism. And if they feel like called out about these behaviors, they'll often react extremely strongly to that.
I'm thinking of Ta-Nehisi Coates' beautiful definition of privilege as not having to take something into account.
Yep.
Not having to take it into account. And when I think about my own brushes up against the kind of people we're talking about here, or that were reported to me, part of what happens is that initially it seems okay. It's not like you get some really bad vibe and you don't have anything to do with them. What's the thing, in the horror films, the monsters in the building, right? That's the kind of scary
the calls
thing.
coming from inside the house.
Yeah,
kind of thing. Yeah, totally.
Right. So suddenly now you realize, whoa, I'm on a work project with this person who's willing to just throw me under the bus and claim credit for my stuff, or that's my boss, or that's my father-in-law, former friend talking about me now on social media, whatever. And the indicator, the first warning often comes where there's this startling recognition of their indifference to, or in other words, not taking into account something really important, like a basic norm of truth-telling and acceptance of personal responsibility, or not taking into account their impact on other people, including yourself. It's like you're startled. You didn't see it coming. It's like, what? And that's often the first indicator. And it boils down to, across all these, that not taking into account, because they don't feel they have to take into account. They don't want to take it into account, because if they had to take it into account, they'd have to change their course accordingly.
To me, a big hallmark of this is a tendency of viewing other people as means to their ends rather than ends in and of themselves. And something to kind of keep in mind, particularly with people on the more narcissistic traits side of the spectrum, is that the end that they could be after could well be having a friend. What this means to them is somebody who supports them, says nice things about them, is a resource that they can tap when needed, those kinds of things, right? The ends that they're looking for are not inherently evil or even problematic in the right circumstances. And they might also be things that we all, to some extent, get out of friendship. But the fundamental motivation is not really about building this like deep, empathic, connected relationship with you. It's building a relationship with you that can then be a thing that they get stuff from. And that kind of framework is something to be very attentive to, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I think another piece of it here that's implicit in what you said is inequity in the flow of attention, or contribution or interest. These are people who love it when you're interested in them, but they don't really ask you very many questions about yourself.
Sure.
Or if they do
You can see
ask
them
you,
kind of zone out. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And you can think of the classic kind of Hollywood line, the two people getting together and one person rattles on for a while and says, "Hey, enough about me. Let's talk about you. What did you think of my screenplay?" You know what I mean? Right? Like that's a clue right there. Or you
Yeah.
realize that you're with them, and when you get together, 80% of the airtime is taken up with them talking about this or this or that, and you get around 20%. Another indicator is that when you push in normal ways for some kind of repair or resetting or readjusting, you don't mind, for example, you don't mind a lunch or two in which it was mostly about them, but by the third time you get together for lunch, getting to know each other, you want to, focus more on what's going on with you, and they really resist that at a kind of a minor level, of course. That's another indicator as well. Resistance to changing the kind of the script in which they want to operate.
That's a huge part of it, Dad. And maybe a little subset of that. Phrases like, if you're really my friend, then fill in the blank. Or, oh, if you really love me, then fill in the blank. These kinds of manipulative, controlling phrases where they start using the relationship as a tool to get something from you.
That's right.
There's a place, I'm personally pretty against relationship testing as a general statement, but there's maybe a place in our relationships from time to time for making a clear communication of, hey, this really matters to me. And it's really important to me that you do this thing because that would just be really meaningful to me.
Yeah.
You can do that, but it's a style of communication. It's a very different tone. It's about the frequency of it. And it's about, I think, the attempt to control behavior.
You're talking here about who gets to put claims on who.
Yes. And
Yep.
is that reciprocal? Yeah,
Yep.
totally.
Exactly right. And if they get to put claims on you, sometimes communicated from their neediness, but you don't get to put claims on them. Guilt tripping is one of the maneuvers you sometimes find here, right? The use of reproach or grievance, endless grievance. That's another indicator because it's a very powerful card to play in relationships. Just to be aggrieved all the time, to come from you did me wrong, you did me dirt, I was cheated, I was mistreated. That's another indicator here, I think, of the kind of people we're talking about.
Great. I think that those are some good examples in more of a everyday kind of common sense way of approaching it. And we're about to get into the what to do part of the conversation, which I think is probably what most people are interested in. But before we get there, I did want to talk about some almost like ethical considerations here that you can have when approaching this stuff. Something we talked about recently in a mailbag that we did is the massive amount of scope creep that has taken place in the last 5 to 10 years as mental health topics and psychology-driven topics have become more popular on social media, places like TikTok, podcasts like this one. And people have gotten very casual about referring to other people as being narcissistic or borderline or whatever else because they saw a TikTok video about it and now they're an expert. There are real consequences to labeling somebody as having these traits, including just inside of our own mind. Like these are, again, very socially negatively loaded traits. You're in a group of friends, you refer to somebody as a narcissist, everybody pays attention.
Yeah.
And everybody is now thinking about that in every interaction they have with that person for the foreseeable future. That's a lot of tone. We should be a little careful about that, right? So there, I think, are some big considerations here. First of all, it's important to keep in mind that there's kind of a difference between not liking somebody or even them being sort of rude to us from time to time and them being either a narcissist or a sociopath. That's the stuff that occurs to me off the top, Dad. I'm wondering if you've thought about this at all.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And I think it's really important that we don't use this new language and understanding as a kind of bludgeon to, for example, undermine the appropriate powerfulness of some people, including people who are finally speaking up about ways they've been mistreated, whether kind of locally in a family situation or more broadly due to cultural factors, social factors, systemic factors. I think that's really true. It's also true that what we're really talking about here is a subclinical personality disorder, in the sense that these are fairly, as you said earlier, traits, innate, but particularly acquired traits that persist across settings, across times, and across relationships. That's what we're really talking about here.
Yeah,
So I
totally.
extremely appreciate your nuance as usual. And then I wanted to throw in an angle if I could. I realized that it's almost as if there are sort of two sort of types of people in this triad. One, I think of as fairly conspicuous, overt bullies, blowhards, Harvey Weinstein. We can get a sense of them as what they are. But okay, that type of person is fairly obvious. And a lot of people, as soon as they recognize it, they're like, I'm out of here. Then there's this really other type that I'm reflecting on where it starts out that this is your friend or your coworker who likes your help, who looks up to you, who admires you, starts feeding you social supplies. They understand the narcissistic supply process. And it all goes along really well. But at some point, if you try to reset the equilibrium in the relationship so it's more reciprocal and you're in it, maybe because you have a need that suddenly emerges, maybe you suffer a tragic loss in your life and suddenly now it's you who, is putting claims on the other person. It's then that this underlying dynamic of Machiavellianism, narcissism, and sociopathy gets revealed and kind of surges to the fore. And this particular type of situation, in my experience, is especially tricky because, as you say, it's disguised, right? Until the pressure's on and then it gets revealed.
Yeah, that second category is where you see people get into abusive relationships, or you see really intense fallout in family systems.
Yeah.
When it's sort of when the kids achieve a level of power where they're able to drop boundaries with a adult family member. That's often where it comes in, not always, but often, who has some of these traits, and that adult family member reacts extremely poorly to that process. Something else I want to mention here is that so much of this is about our lens, like the lens of relationship that we have with another person. Let's take a phrase. I'd like to see you more often. What does that phrase mean to you? Is that a kind phrase? Is it displaying a lot of interest in the other person? Is it emotionally empathic? Is it engaged? Are they trying to control your behavior? Are they trying to influence you? Are they being manipulative? I don't know. It's just a phrase. It could be any of those things, right? So much of this is context dependent. And I think part of it is about appreciating how the way that something lands on us is often about us. It's not always about the other person. And that's another reason why it's appropriate to be a little bit sensitive, a little bit careful about attributing these kinds of particularly very intense diagnostic language onto other people. So let's say that you're in one of those relationships, Dad. You've recognized that this other person, your parent, your boss, your friend, your whatever, is, looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. You can't just leave for whatever reason. Maybe you don't want to. Maybe you just can't. It has a job you need and you're kind of stuck with this boss. How would you start thinking about how you're going to act with that person?
Well, as we prepared for this and you did your usual, people don't probably realize this who just listen to the pod, but Forrest does an incredible amount of prep for each episode. And
thanks, Dan.
And it ends up in our notes and it's fantastic. You identified for us, I thought, some 4 major categories: awareness, boundary setting, thoughtful communication, and self-care. So maybe I could start with awareness. And it's, of course, really helpful to try to be forewarned about this kind of person, especially if, like me, you tend to see the best in people. Like many people, see the best in people, and have a kind of, in my case, I've had a kind of naive, childlike, innocent trustingness that's been taken advantage of. So if you have any tendencies along these lines, or ways in which maybe you grew up with this kind of a person as a step parent or an older sibling, or your first love of your life, if you have any tendencies to kind of fall into this script with that kind of person, especially be on the lookout for them. Point two about awareness, uh, when you get the first indicator, pay attention to it. Sometimes that other person is just, they've just got a blinding headache. Something just happened in their life. Yeah, it didn't mean anything. But if they do it twice, right? Whatever it might be, of the kinds of things that you and I have talked about before, including just at a kind of a personal level, like seeming really startled at the various notion that there should be basic reciprocity in a friend relationship. And in that is sometimes a kind of disenchantment that you wake up from a sort of spell cast by this person. Sometimes what happens is it's initially shocking, like you can't believe it. You're so startled. I didn't see that coming. Other times, suddenly it's as if the dots start connecting together and you realize, oh, okay, that's what I'm really dealing with here. So then you kind of get it. And then on the heels of that, to finish, there can be a real grieving. Like, darn, I'm so disappointed. I had a lot of hopes for this relationship. Because as you say, Forrest, for people to be able to get away with this package, they really have to have typically a lot going for them.
Yeah.
They get charm, bright, looks, juice, charisma, vibe, frankly, sexiness. Sometimes that matters too. All right. And there's can be a loss there, disappointment, and also a sense of chagrin. Like, how could I have been so stupid? You start blaming yourself.
I wasted all of this time.
Yeah.
That's a big phrase I hear a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really understandable. And keep in mind, this is about them. They took advantage of you. You came into this with an open heart, in good faith. Most likely it was your virtues, your sense of responsibility, your willingness to look at yourself as the culprit in different situations, the generosity of heart, your compassion for others. It was these positive qualities in you that made you accessible to and vulnerable to, this kind of mistreatment from that other person. So try to keep that in mind as well. And then move past to, okay, like it or not, this is what I'm dealing with here.
What are we doing?
Now, what am I going to do?
Yeah. Maybe more in the, and I thought that was great, Dad, maybe a little bit more in the now what am I going to do aspect of awareness. When I get to a place where I recognize that I have a friend, a coworker, or whatever, who has that more egocentric personality structure in particular, it is in my mind all the time when I'm interacting with them. Every single interaction I have with that person, this fact is floating around for me in the background. It might not be operating at the very front of my forehead, but it's operating at the back of my forehead. And that operation is then helping me make choices about the kinds of conversations I have with them, the kinds of topics I do and don't bring up. Topic control, I think, is a huge part of this. And I'm just trying to avoid situations that I could easily get sucked into that are going to make things more complicated for me. That's a big thing I'm trying to avoid, is complication inside of the relationship. And this then kind of naturally takes us to the second of those four categories, which is boundary setting. I think this is the biggest part of the game. And a big place where we can set boundaries, because we can't always set them externally. We can a lot of the time, but we can't always, is inside of yourself. What are the things that you just won't allow yourself to do with this person, regardless of how fun or how okay or how well they're doing or whatever? You're just not going to let that happen, okay? Because for me, it's really an agency thing. Like, that's where I can intervene.
Boundaries inside your own mind, I find, is actually the beginning, and it's the strongest, safest thing you can do. Because even setting an overt boundary, including, we need to do a quick call out here about safety.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, because
huge piece.
Abusive relationships usually are in the dark triad. I'm thinking from time to time, Forrest, we should identify characters in fiction, like movie clips or TV shows or related to various things. And I'm thinking here about the film with, I believe, Jennifer Lopez, Enough, in which her husband starts out as a real charmer and he becomes physically abusive, even lethally so. And then, the movie unfolds from there. It's a good description. in a way of that kind of a person. So obviously, the safest place is to set a boundary inside yourself, and then over time do what you can that's safe for you. And if your own physical safety is at all, or your children or others you care about, is even at risk, it's generally recommended that you reach for resources outside of the relationship first, including sometimes you have to be very careful about that. And there's a fair amount of good wisdom about that. Get resources outside the relationship, including ranging, potentially a shelter you just go
Mm-hmm.
to. And then from there, work on the relationship if there's any hint of
Yes.
violence. Yeah. So inside yourself, and I think one of them is where you basically say to yourself, I'm just not going to care about that anymore. I'm not going to believe that anymore. I'm not going to let myself be worked on that anymore. They can run their guilt trip number. They can be threatening and intimidating. They can plea for my help. Inside myself, I'm just not going to let that control me. That's an internal boundary. I'm not going to take responsibility for their pain. I'm not responsible. I'm not going to do that. That's, I think, a really important point. And I will do little things, I admit it, inside the inner temple with certain kind of people. I just keep reminding myself, it's like a sign flashing, they're over there, I'm over here. Or it's a weird one, I'm not implicated in their mind stream. They have their own stream of consciousness. I have compassion for them. I wish them well, and it's not my fault. I'm not implicated. Or maybe even imagine a very thick wall of glass between you and them. They're saying it, but those messages are landing on the other side of the glass barrier, and they're not entering into your innermost being. Things like that can be actually really, really helpful for people neurologically when they're seducing you or manipulating you or trying to intimidate you. Tune into your own breathing in your chest as a whole. The internal sensations in your body, and particularly as a whole, tend to strengthen the sense of ongoingness and that you're okay. And they tend to strengthen your own sense of being grounded and not overwhelmed by, what's coming at you.
Something I've become increasingly attentive to in my life is situations where things just feel really fuzzy with
Ah,
people. And it's hard to articulate this by their very nature. Fuzzy things are hard to talk about. A lot of the time, people who have this combination of traits
yeah,
really hate clarity. Clarity is kind of the enemy.
because it would pin them down.
Yeah, it would pin them down. It reduces their ability to do this different stuff with you. So they hate referring to the text. Note taking is the enemy. Okay. So if you can, again, this might be a form of more of a externalized boundary as opposed to one inside of yourself. See what it's like to make a clear agreement with them.
Yeah.
Are they open to making a clear agreement where, you say, hey, on Thursday, we're going to do A, B, and C. Are you up for doing A, B, and C? And they say, oh, okay, sure, maybe something like that. And you're like, well, okay, on Thursday, are you okay with doing A, B, and C? Again, there's this sort of fuzz that can permeate it. And your own willingness to get to clarity, particularly in more of a professional relationship, is where you can really do things like this formally and do sort of clear note taking around it. Even just for yourself, honestly, if you feel like you're in a situation, this is another term that gets overused a lot, but if you feel like you're in a real situation where somebody is actually gaslighting you, you're actually starting to doubt your experience of reality and starting to have a hard time inside of yourself determining whether or not the thoughts that you're having or the memories that you're having are truly accurate or not, start writing stuff down, just kind of descriptive. On April 4th, he said that he would pick up the kids at Y time. And then on April 5th, he did not pick up the kids at Y time. Whatever it is, like really keep a journal for yourself of these interactions. It can be very clarifying.
That's great. And I got to tell you, as we talk here, I'm reminded of people I've had to deal with in therapy, like Yeah. So it's all coming back to me, Forrest.
Stories removed
Curse
to protect
you.
the innocent
I
or the not
tried
so
to
innocent.
forget. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in a way, you're getting at trust. And you're describing people that we can, if you will, trust to be sociable and pleasant as long as XYZ.
Yeah.
So we trust them
It's
for
all
that.
conditional.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
And I think that in terms of setting boundaries, one of the things that we do and can do is to unilaterally, we don't need their permission. That's an internal boundary to remind yourself, I don't need their permission to do this or that, right? Setting that inside yourself. And then on the basis of it, often without discussion, you just disengage from them and you only engage with them in the space that you can trust them in. Very simple. So, quick story for myself. I had a boss a long time ago, nearly 40 years ago, who way back when was tried to stiff me out of several $1,000s 35 years ago, 40 years ago that he owed me. And it blew my mind because he was such a nice guy. But I came to realize that in certain areas, I could not trust him. But I could trust him to, have a charming conversation at a party. So that's what I mean. Sometimes what we do when we set boundaries externally, we just do it, on our own. We don't have to explain. We don't need their permission. We definitely should not apologize, but we just do it. And then life goes a lot better because to ground a relationship that's bigger than its foundations in trust is a setup for great danger. On the other hand, if you can trust the person and the relationship is smaller than the opportunity for trust, well, then sometimes that's a missed opportunity. But to go the other way, that's kind of dangerous.
So if you're communicating with somebody, if you need to have a conversation, particularly about something that where there's, some amount of stake on the table with somebody with this kind of a structured ad, is there a way that you're approaching it or the way that you're thinking about it?
Well, we wrote a lot about this in our book, Resilient, in terms of the strengths there around intimacy, which is grounded in autonomy, and then also in the chapter on courage, interpersonal courage, and even the one on generosity, which is about forgiveness. So people can check that out. I think that what's really helpful is, first of all, to clarify in your own mind what's actually true, and then clarify for yourself what do you care about? What are the relevant principles or values? Like reciprocity. Loose reciprocity over time is of value. Truth telling, willingness to take responsibility for broken agreements and to keep the agreement going forward. What are the basic principles you care about? And then sort out what it is that you're asking for and what it is that you're simply communicating. Asking for, that takes you down the road of agreement setting. And often these kind of people don't want to do that. And by the second or third time you've gone through this process and they've, broken the agreement, you start to see what you're dealing with here. People in this dark triad territory don't have much of a learning curve about it. I mean, for example, in psychotherapy world, the success rate in treatment, as it were, for narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder, as it's called, is notoriously low. It's tough because these people like being the way they are and don't intend to change it. It's the problem of other people who need to adjust to them, right? So you realize I'm going to take a few shots at trying to say something to you, but fairly quickly, if I realize that this is like trying to get blood from a stone, then I move on. And then at that point, it's not so much making requests, but it's making declarations.
Yes. Yeah. We move from asking to telling pretty
To
rapidly.
notifying.
Yeah. Notifying. Notifying is a good way to put it.
Yeah.
I also think that a part of this is gets to the style of communication that gets used. Again, fuzz is the enemy here.
Yeah.
So the more that you can be not unkind, not even pushy, but just direct and clear and non-emotional, the less fuzz you will find yourself in. It's really easy to get sucked into an argument with other people. It's really easy for them in particular to start getting choosy about language, choosy about specific words. What do you mean by this word that you used? I'm having a hard time finding the perfect example here. Again, like fuzz is sometimes hard to talk about. But there are situations where you'll be talking to somebody and you'll say something along the lines of, hey, in this kind of a situation, if you're going to come to it, I need you to not do this sort of a behavior, whatever the sort of behavior is. Maybe it gets to substance use. Maybe it's about interacting with a person at the party. In general, I would try to avoid inviting this person to a situation where I felt like I needed to regulate their behavior, because part of the personality structure is that it's very difficult to regulate their behavior, but just as an example here. And if you get asked a question in response along the lines of like, well, what do you mean, behave appropriately? What do you mean not drink? Like, is one drink not drinking? Like, are you worried about my drinking? Or are you worried about my me being drunk? We're already in the danger zone. We're already way in the danger zone. And this is a kind of behavior that I think that people with this constellation of traits tend to do a lot. What do you think about this, Dad? You can maybe put a finer point on this. I feel like I'm struggling to articulate it.
I'm so glad that you're bringing this up because you're really talking about people where they move from the particular topic on the table, like, how buzzed are they at a family gathering?
Yeah, great. Yep. Good example.
And for them, it moves really fast past how buzzed they're going to be and some kind of reasonable understanding about to the larger thing that they're resisting being quote unquote controlled or regulated. And they're resisting their basic script, which is I get to be freewheeling and other people need to, stay within the lines and meet my needs. And what you can do when you're talking with them is you can track that movement. And particularly if you see that for a certain person, their primary aim is to avoid any kind of normal range, reciprocal, working stuff out with friends, family members, coworkers, whatever, that's about aligning around behavioral expectations that are shared in common. That's a fancy way of putting it. They just don't want to do that. They're going to fight you on that. And they don't really understand why you should even have the right. Because to use a kind of an example, if your proper function in life is to essentially serve as their right arm, it's appalling to them and astounding that the right arm and the right hand would think it has any rights of its own.
Would rebel against its owner. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, what? It's a little bit as if the hand started talking. Hey, Rick, don't be such a fool. Like that would be shocking to them. So when you start to get the feeling that you're the palm of their hand and they don't understand why you're speaking up in any individuated way that is not like-minded. People in this territory pull for like-mindedness, and they don't really understand differences, that other people have needs and wants of their own that have as much standing as theirs. And so when you start to realize that what you're bumping into is a lack of that underlying assumption that others have the basically same standing you do, and so forth, that's a real clue also that you're dealing with this kind of a person.
Thank you for helping me there with figuring out how to put words to that, because it's such an experience that I've had sometimes in interacting with people. But again, like the fuzz is the enemy. It's sometimes hard to figure out exactly how to talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and they're really good at pushing the accountability ball across to your side of the court.
Yes.
They're really good at making it seem like this is about you. Right? Why are you complaining so much? Or why are you so uptight? Or why are you so protective of others? Or don't you trust me? Well, actually, no, I don't trust you.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. If you really loved me, you would just accept all of me is definitely a thing. I do want to speak to a particular situation that I do think can happen.
Yeah.
You can have a friend or a family member or a romantic partner who has some of, as a whisper, has a pixie dust of these different traits. So in like a normal range, we are all a little bit narcissistic. Everybody has normal range variation around these different traits. It's all okay. With somebody who you've really cultivated a positive relationship with alongside those traits, it might be possible to have a direct conversation with them about aspects of these things. Aspects of, hey, Bob, in the flow of a normal conversation, you get into, well, I just feel like you kind of mostly care about yourself, or hey, I feel like you have a hard time kind of seeing me as my own individual person with my own individual needs. It might be possible to get there. Most of the time, with most people, it is not possible to get there. And rather than focusing on the personality construction of a person, it's generally more helpful to focus just on behavior. Kind of like you were saying, Dad, to get specific about behavior and to be clear about behavior and to establish standards of behavior where you can, as opposed to getting sucked into a conversation about the deeper personality traits that behavior is based off of.
I want to talk about countertransference.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, that's a psych term, goes back to psychoanalysis. It's the idea that we transfer into here and now relationships, patterns that we've learned previously, including going all the way back to the childhood. So Freud initially talked about the client or patient's transference to the psychotherapist, various kinds of things. And then the term evolved countertransference, the reaction of the therapist to the client. And what's one thing that's really useful about that is to use that as basic information. So for example, for me, if I'm around somebody and I start feeling like I need to keep doing things to prove my worth, that's an internal, big, flashing light warning. I'm dealing with someone who's probably fairly narcissistic on the other side of the table. That's an internal cue. So if you're, for example, starting to feel like you're just foggy or fuzzy about what the facts really are, it's sort of like, they talked about Steve Jobs having this reality distortion field, radiating out from him, in which, in good ways, I guess, he was getting people super psyched about his products. And then they'd leave the meeting, and a day or so later, they would think, what was he talking about? Well, if you start feeling like you're in a reality distortion field internally, you're like, okay, that's a good indicator. If you start feeling like you're in doubt of your own worth around this person, that's an indicator. If you feel smaller rather than larger as a being around this kind of person, that's another indicator. If you start questioning in ways that are not constructive, but are kind of toxic for you, the justice, the worthiness in what it is that you're asking for, the legitimacy of what it is you're asking for, that's another clue. And also, I would say that if you feel like somewhat you're on eggshells with this other person and you need to placate them or kind of appease them to keep everything going on an even keel, that's another internal countertransferential clue, as it were, as well.
I think that's an incredible list, Dad, and a great way of simplifying some of the terminology that we've explored throughout this episode down to more of a feeling-driven kind of everyday sense that we might have inside of ourselves. Because I don't know why I keep on saying it toward the end of this episode, but the fuzz is the enemy. There's something about these relationships where there is a fuzziness to them that can creep in, that makes them actually difficult to talk about or explore inside of ourselves, because we feel a way, but we don't really know why we feel the way. And am I the problem? Are they the problem? This cloud of mystery that supports people, frankly, in maintaining the facade that's associated with their behavior.
That's so perceptive, I think. Like there's a place for fuzz. Like if in relationships with
stuff's complicated,
regular folks, they're not in this triad. Yeah, it's kind of fuzzy. And it doesn't feel like you get ambushed out of the shadows.
Sure,
right?
Yeah. Nobody's lurking in the dark.
Yeah, you work it out. Like you and I, we work stuff out. What are we talking about? It's a little fuzzy, but we clarify it or something. Okay. But if you're with a particular person and routinely that when it's fuzzy, you get the shaft. By the second time that's happened, that's a big warning sign. That's a big orange light flashing on the inner dashboard, at least.
Totally. And to maybe put a slightly finer point on something that I was saying earlier, I am a guy who loves a clarifying question.
Yeah, that's true.
I am here all day for like, do not
Yeah.
get me wrong. I love a clarifying question. I think that, hey, what do you mean by fill in the blank is a phenomenal question. It's about the way that that question is offered, and is that question the constant question?
Yeah.
Particularly when every time that you feel like you're trying to influence this person's behavior. If every response to influence a person has makes you start to feel like you're engaging in a legal argument, that is a very good sign that something is going sideways.
Yeah.
So, as we get to the end here, I had one more point on our little 4-point plan here, and that's self care. And I think it's really important to recognize, particularly if you're in situations where you can't easily escape this person. They're in that family member, boss, really good friend of a really good friend sort of situation where you're just kind of around them a lot. These relationships take a toll on us because we need to think about all of this BS constantly while we're interacting with this person. That is a real cost. Maintaining it requires way more of your energy than it would if they didn't have those traits, right? And so this means that you are probably going to need some additional time, some additional space for the things that recharge you, that make you feel good. It also means that it's good to understand your vulnerabilities because, believe me, these people also understand your vulnerabilities and they will deliberately push on them if they need to. Can you do things to anticipate that when going into an interaction with them, to prepare yourself for that kind of exploitative behavior, if that's something that you're going to have to deal with? Is there anything else that you would like to add here, Dad?
I want to talk about this in workplace settings. 2 suggestions here that I think are related to work relationships, frankly, and also romantic relationships. One is build up a paper trail, especially in a work environment. Just as you said, Forrest, an email trail, memorializing understandings, jotting down your notes, walking out of a meeting, and in a very good faith kind of way, putting it on the table, inviting the oversight of third parties. Very often, again, one of the tells. Oh, and this could lead into cultism. Gosh, we could really talk about that because very often charismatic leaders of cults have these qualities. One of the characteristics of someone in the Stark Triad is they try to get you alone. They don't want other witnesses. They don't like that. They don't want to spread the information out. So workplace setting or otherwise, getting other people involved, building up a paper trail, really, really good. Last, I find it really helpful to just keep in mind that 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, maybe 1 in 100 chance that the wheels could really come off catastrophically. And this person could really seek to do you harm. Do not underestimate what people can do when push comes to shove. And I'm going to put it a certain kind of way. The primate mask falls away. And what's revealed is this reptilian core. Be thoughtful. Be careful. Take your time, especially if it's a significant consequential relationship. Not to get freaked out, not to be morbid, not to play too many, thrillers and horror movies in your mind. and
something to be attentive to. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. No,
Keep your
it's
eyes
a
wide
real
open for
thing. And if you interact with 100 people over the course of your life, statistically, 1 or 2 of them are going to be a diagnosable narcissist.
Yeah.
1 or 2 of them are going to be a diagnosable sociopath.
Yeah.
These are real things that happen to people. And it's good to both be aware of them without allowing the fact that these are possible things, without allowing that to just totally overwhelm us, cloud us, just create a lot of needless anxiety.
Yeah.
Maybe transport some of that into perfectly healthy, perfectly normal relationships with really normal people who are just expressing their own normal narcissistic needs or having a just kind of a bad moment in an interaction with you. And so writing that line is a lot of what we're talking about here today.
Yeah. That leads me to, if I could, for us, surface a couple quick points here.
Yeah, sure.
There will be people who have some of these tendencies themselves who are listening here. What do you do about that? And so I want to say that it's not unusual at all for people, when push comes to shove, to have some of these qualities. Or just unwittingly, they grew up in various environments. Maybe they grew up with privilege in certain kinds of ways. They just didn't know better. They just kind of expected that, they never had to carry money because somebody else always just sort of handled that for them. They didn't know. So what do you do then? And I think that there's really a place for growth in this area, for realizing, okay, I have some of these tendencies. Maybe they're the result of a lot of mistreatment. I mean, for example, in childhood, if your normal narcissistic needs are, for various reasons, not really met by your parents or your peers, then it's understandable sometimes when you become an adult that there's this unresolved hunger inside for those kind of supplies. Maybe you lack certain social skills. You just grew up in a different kind of environment that didn't really particularly take others into account. Okay, there are lots of things a person can do to kind of reestablish themselves in a fundamental integrity system in which they open their heart to others and take others into account in a way that is relatively normal range and, reciprocal. And that's something any individual can do. And it's really important. You're not stuck. Second, I'm thinking, frankly, of many cases where people crashed and burned. They went through, they had these characteristics. They may have grown up perhaps in violent settings where it was unsafe to not live in the dark triad. That was their model for relationships. And then they ended up in prison, let's say. They took a hard look at their life. Or maybe they didn't end up in prison, but something happened that led them also perhaps around religion sometimes. They took a really hard look on their life, and they really changed as a result. So I want to make sure that we maintain our growth mindset here, in terms of what's really possible, and that we open it up, obviously for, people to find their way home, to really, really listening to the better angels of their nature.
Yeah, love that, Dad. I think it's a great note to end our conversation today on. As per the norm with these topics, we could just kind of keep on going here. There's a lot to talk about. Thanks again, Dad, for doing this with me. This was really great. So what are some of the things to look out for here? First, a excessive focus on the self. Rick had a great line. It was something along the lines of, when you assert your own needs, they look at you kind of like you're a hand that just started talking to them, because they have this sense of their individual self as the sun around which everything revolves. And the notion that a planet could just start spinning off into the solar system on its own is just like kind of mind-boggling for them. These people often have a very difficult time admitting fault. They tend to express limited remorse or guilt when they are at fault, and they tend to have a lack of genuine empathy. It's important to keep in mind here that the ends that this person might be pursuing could also coincide with the ends that you want to pursue. Maybe their end is developing a really great friendship with you, because friendships are really useful. Friendships are resources that can be tapped when needed. It gets them somebody who says nice things about them. Yeah, I love a friendship. But the fundamental orientation is highly self-centered. Another great indicator is manipulative or controlling behavior, particularly things like gaslighting, which we talked about briefly during the episode. This is when you cause somebody to doubt themselves or their experience of reality. It's also one of those terms that has been popularized and therefore is used very excessively and very inaccurately by people. But if you're really questioning your own reality, and particularly your own recollection of events, and if you start to feel yourself get really sucked into their recollection of events, but you look back at the journal that you keep and wow, their recollection is really different from what's in that journal, that's a really good indicator. We then moved toward talking about what we can do inside of these interactions and inside of these relationships with people. But before we did that, we gave a couple of disclaimers here. First, there is a big difference between somebody's behavior in a unique setting and their personality structure as a whole. Your boss might seem like a narcissist to you, but not present that way at all at home, because it's a totally different setting and they're not actually a narcissist. And so, yeah, it's still a problem for you, but it doesn't mean that they have diagnosable NPD. It could also be a situation where you and your boss come from different cultural backgrounds or have very different assumptions about the way that a work relationship works. And there's a difference here between not liking somebody, or even them being kind of mean to us pretty regularly, and then being either a narcissist or a sociopath. Not all bad behavior is indicative of somebody's underlying personality structure. It could be that the two of you just don't get along. And at the same time, we have to balance all of those truths with protecting ourselves and with seeing the world clearly and not getting sucked in to that kind of a gaslighting process. So there's a real line that we're walking here. I tend to walk it on the side of being very careful about thinking about somebody this way or referring to somebody this way, particularly referring to somebody this way with other people. Okay, so you've recognized that your friend, your boss, maybe your significant other, who knows, has these kinds of tendencies. What do we do? Rick made a great point. I want to say it again at the end of this episode. If you are interacting with somebody who is at the high end of this spectrum, maybe they're not formally diagnosable, but man, they've got a lot of these traits. And particularly if you're in a relationship with them, the first step in any kind of abusive or exploitative relationship is to establish as much safety as possible. Do whatever you can to make yourself more safe. The second is to figure out how to escape that relationship. Those are the two things that you do. You establish safety, you create a plan, then you get out of there. And from there, from that safe distance, then you can make some choices. Then you can start doing some different things. But it is so important to protect yourself first. And that's really outside of the scope of this conversation, but we did want to name it here. So then turning toward the more mild to moderate side of the spectrum, or maybe situations where it's really difficult for you to leave this other person for whatever reason, most of the good advice falls into 4 categories. First, awareness. Second, boundary setting. Third, thoughtful communication. And then fourth, self-care. Starting with awareness, when you're interacting with somebody who has this kind of a personality structure, it is really important to keep that fact floating around in the back of your mind most of the time. This could mean avoiding different topics or putting on your own mask with them that supports you in protecting yourself. And this transitions smoothly into boundary setting. And Rick really emphasized the importance of setting boundaries inside of yourself. It can be difficult, if not actively dangerous, to set boundaries externally with somebody who has these traits. But you can set boundaries inside of yourself. What are the things that you're going to stop worrying about with this person? Are you going to let go of a need to be approved of by them, a need to be loved by them, a need to be seen by them in a certain kind of way? What are the behaviors that you're going to choose to stop doing with this person? What are the conversations you're going to avoid with them? What are the settings that you're just not going to be around them in anymore? How can you set boundaries inside of yourself? That's where you have the most agency that really protect your peace. This then segued into a conversation that we had about fuzz, which was fuzzy to talk about, difficult to talk about, but I think is really an important part of all of this. When you're communicating with somebody who has these personality traits, it is really easy to get sucked into discussions or arguments that start to feel really complicated and kind of unclear, and no one really knows exactly what other people are saying. There's a lot of legalese about what did we mean by this sort of a word. And that fuzz really permeates interactions with people who have those personality traits because the fuzz supports them, the fog supports them in keeping up the charade. They hate relentless clarity. They hate written agreements. What does this mean? It's really helpful to be clear, and it's really helpful to particularly create clear agreements when you can. The setting where it's easiest to do this in a safe way is at work, but there might be ways to do this in your personal relationships as well. Finally, self-care. You can recognize that managing all of this stuff, dealing with all of this overhead inside of an interaction that you don't have with somebody who doesn't have these traits comes with real costs for you. Costs of your time, costs of your effort, costs of your brain space occupied by thinking about this stuff. And you really have to balance maintaining a relationship with this kind of a person against those costs if it's a relationship that's volitional for you. It also means that you might have to set aside some additional time to take care of yourself, to do the practices that you know are fulfilling for you. It might mean understanding some of your vulnerabilities and the ways in which that person could activate those vulnerabilities, even deliberately. Then Rick closed by mentioning that even if you do all of these things, it's important to remember that the wheels could really fall off here. These are often pretty volatile people. And because they lack empathy, and because they don't have a great sense for social norms or moral behavior, or they do have a great sense for it and they just don't care about it at all, relationships with these people can really go sideways. So it's important to protect ourselves along the way, including really considering what we're going to do if things do go sideways with this person. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I had a really good time with this one. If you've been listening for a while and you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, please subscribe when you have a chance. If you've been listening and you would prefer to be watching it, you can find us on YouTube, but you can just search for Forrest Hanson and you'll find my channel. And if you'd like to support us in other ways, you can find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And for just a couple of dollars a month, you can support the show and you'll receive a bunch of bonuses in return. Until next time, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.